So what I'm going to talk to you about today is how to run a meeting. What I know about it is from being a deacon in the church or going to Civitan meetings or in my fraternity, that's how we ran the meetings, was Robert's Rules of Order. And you can use it for the most formal situation or the most informal situation because it's flexible and it works. And what it does is it permits you to have a meeting that's so you can get things done. The chair of the board, of course, is the most important person to know and understand Robert's Rules of Order, but every single member really needs to know and understand. You can simply go to Books A Million or wherever, and if you'll just go and ask them, where's Robert's Rules of Order, they all know, they've all read every book in there, and they'll take you to the section and they'll show you the little outlines, or you can get the whole thing. It's about 800 pages if you want to. I would never do that. Just get something and gives you a rough outline, and I've given you a little punch list of just common motions. Now, this is just a fraction of the motions that are in Robert's Rules of Order, but these will get you through a meeting in essence. There's two things that are the operating manual for a board, well, for any board, but for the Board of Health, what you guys do. One is your bylaws, and the other is Robert's Rules of Order. Now, I thought someone was going to speak to you about bylaws, so I'm not really going to get into that, but y'all know what bylaws are. Number one, they're mandated. Sid mentioned yesterday that the statute that creates the boards of health in all 159 counties mandates that you have that you set up yourselves under a set of bylaws. That's about all it says. It doesn't really say anything further. You can set it up, any way you please. Then it goes on to say, of course, 7 members, and we all understand that, 4 of which are controlled by the county commissioners, and then 2 of them by the mayor of the largest city in the county, and then 1 is superintendent of schools. So that's mandated. So you got a small board, and so by its very nature, you're going to want a good bit of informality, which will give you the flexibility to be able to move through your meetings quickly. Robert's Rules of Order mentions the bylaws over and over and over again, just numerous times. They're critically important, and the reason is this. In your bylaws, and Sid gave you an example to follow, and he said yesterday too, and I even asked him specifically, I said, I didn't see that mandated in the statute anywhere. And he said, no, it's not mandated in the statute, but I just pulled this and just to give people an idea about how to set up, your bylaws. Now, if everybody's got bylaws, then that's fine. It doesn't really matter. But Robert's Rules of Order, if you mandate in your bylaws, and you're supposed to do that when your board is created, that your procedure will be dictated by Robert's Rules of Order, which I'm sure they all are, because that's what everybody follows, then that's what controls if your bylaws don't address the issue. So what you might want to think about is if there's something that's bothering y'all, if your chairman is continually having the same type problem, or if you're a board member and you notice that something issue is bothering you, then you might just talk with folks, and the thing to do is to just move to amend the bylaws, because you can make your bylaws as long as you want to, and they can contradict Robert's Rules of Order almost every way they want to. Just there's very, very rare exceptions, and so the bylaws are extremely important. The bylaws and Robert's Rules of Order are considered your operating manual, so to speak, to run your board. The thing to remember is that Robert's Rules of Order is the leading authority in the world today. It's how every board practically in the United States operates. It's founded on democracy because this guy was a career military guy, and so you'll notice in there that it's very democratic, which means that it's an effort to give everyone an opportunity to participate. You got 7 board members, and let's say 5 of them are just convinced to do something. Well, Robert's Rules of Order is designed so that these other 2 don't get run over. They get a chance to be heard. And then if they can't carry, then that's fine, but at least their rights are protected. Every one of you 7 folks that belong on this board has a job to do. Maybe you're the doctor on the board. Maybe you're the representative of the needy and the elderly or the consumer or whatever. You've got a specific duty, plus you've got an overall duty. And so your voice is just as important as anybody else on that board. And also remember, like I mentioned earlier, that the Robert's rules are the final word unless the bylaws contradict. Now, everybody knows this too, but I'm going to mention it because it's mentioned in the, Roberts goes chronologically. So it talks about officers. There are 2 that are mandated that you really can't have a meeting without. One is the chair, which would be the chair, Madam Chair is typically the way a female is addressed, or Mr. Chairman if it's a man. And the other is the secretary, because we're controlled, I say we, the boards of health are controlled by the open meetings law, which was mentioned yesterday. Sid mentioned that. And you got to be real careful with that. Now, I've been practicing law a long time, and I've seen a lot of lawsuits. I don't ever remember seeing a board of health sued, but it would only take one time for it to be a real nightmare. So it'd be really nice to avoid that. And as he mentioned too, you're covered by the general liability policy of the state. That's done by statute. Even though you're not an employee of the state, you're not an employee of the county, but since you are members of the board, then if you're acting in your official capacity, so you have to be very careful about that, and that's why the open meetings law has to be followed. For instance, the notice of the meeting, that law mandates that it be posted in advance. The agenda must be posted in advance. The minutes must be posted within 2 days after the meeting. Now, who does that? I don't have any idea, but anyway, that's what the law requires, or the open meetings law. You can have as many officers as you want. A chair necessarily to run the meeting, and a secretary to take the minutes and keep up with what's going on. You can have a vice chair and treasurer or whatever else you want to have, makes no difference. But only being 7 folks, then that, I know a lot of boards only have 2 officers or whatever, and you're certainly free to do that as you please. Then Roberts goes on to talk about duties of officers, and it encourages you to list your officers, list what qualifications are required, list the job description for those respective officers, and be very specific about it in your bylaws. Put those in your bylaws. Now, some do, I'm sure, and some don't, but that's Robert's Rules of Order recommends that. Now, it also then talks about what does a chair do? What is the responsibility? And it talks about that the chair leads using democratic principles, that the primary job of the chair is to guard the rights of everyone, all 7 people, in a democratic fashion. Now, it also goes on to say that when you address the chair, well, if, like I said earlier, if it's a man, you would say, instead of saying, "Now, Charlie," what they want you to do in order, for decorum's sake, just like they do on television, is say, "Mr. Chairman." And then when the chair has to rule on something to make a decision, they want the chair to speak in the 3rd person. And if you do that, fine, and if you don't, well. Now, the president, or the chair, as we call them, gives up or sacrifices certain duties when they assume that position, or certain rights, I guess is the easiest way to put it. They're not allowed to make a motion. They're not allowed to debate, and they're not allowed to vote on a motion. Their job is to be independent and to maintain impartiality, and to let the rest of the board members handle this. And there's an exception. There's a couple of exceptions. One is if the chair feels strongly about it, then they can designate. They would say, "Mr. Johnson, will you please take the chair?" And of course, it'd be smart to ask him before you did it, before the meeting started. "Would you take the chair and serve as the chair? I want to make a motion, and I want to debate the motion." Then the chair can do that. But once the chair steps down, then they cannot step back up and reassume until that's completely disposed of. And in what instance that would occur, I don't know, but it's just something that's interesting to know. The other required officer is a secretary. The secretary works with the chair to prepare the agenda, and the agenda is very, very important to record everything, whether it's minutes or lists of memberships or notice of meetings or whatever the case might be. That's the responsibility of the secretary, unless it's changed by the bylaws, working in conjunction with the chair and keeping up with everything. For instance, if you don't know where your bylaws are, nobody seems to know, then that's the secretary's job, is to keep up with all documents and minutes. There's two things that are very necessary for a meeting, to run a meeting. The first thing is do I have a quorum? And that's the number one question. I had this conversation, she's not in here, but not for last, with a chair. And she said, sometimes I have to get on the phone, and Robert's Rules of Order even talks about that. If you come in and you see bump, 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 ooh. Well, first of all, if your bylaws don't mention what a quorum is, then Roberts tells you that it's a majority of the membership. Well, of 7, then that would be 4. So you're hung with that, but that's okay if that's what you want. Now, a lot of boards operate on the chair and 3, which is easier, but you got to be careful, because the idea behind a quorum, actually the definition of a quorum is such number as is competent to transact business. So, I mean, that's what it means. So, but the whole point is to control so that a minority does not take off and run with something. No. If it's Roberts goes ahead and says that if the chair should not take the chair until a quorum is present, because the problem you run into is if the chair comes in and there's not a quorum and you take the chair and start the meeting, all you can do is adjourn. You can conduct no business whatsoever. I mean, you can conduct business all you want to, but it's null and void. It doesn't amount to anything. So it's really the best thing to do is do like this lady said, just get on the phone and start calling people. If a quorum is lost during a meeting, I mean, we've all seen this, somebody has to go. They got to pick up their daughter or whatever the case might be. If you lose your quorum, debate can continue. If there's a debate, if there's a motion on the floor and there's debate going on, the debate can continue unless somebody objects. If somebody objects, it's got to stop right there. If nobody objects, the debate can continue, but you can't move to a vote. So there's very little business that can be conducted, even if it's underway. The exception that I mentioned just a minute ago is an emergency situation. If the Board of Health had to meet and there was a real emergency, you couldn't get a quorum, you can act. What you got to do is the next meeting, as soon as you get your quorum, is you have to ask that they rectify and approve whatever action was taken. But it's got to be a bona fide emergency, according to Roberts. And once again, any of these issues, if you worry about them, you can cover them in your bylaws. The first thing is the quorum. The second thing is the agenda. Those are the two most important things. The agenda is really your accepted order of business or the program of business. And we're required, or the boards of health are required, to prepare that and post it in advance of the meeting. So because of the open meeting, people can go and look at it theoretically. I know some boards of health have a lot of community participation, some don't. It just depends. But the theory behind it is if someone wants to go and look and see what's going to come up in a particular meeting, they've got the opportunity to do that, and then they can come to the meeting knowing what's going to go on. The first principle behind parliamentary procedure and the agenda is why it's so important is because it dictates the principle, which is take up one item at a time and deal with that and then move to the next item. And because people, we all are like this, want to bounce around, but the rules won't let you do that. Now, it goes on to say that it lists a typical agenda. Now, you all know how to put an agenda together. You've been doing it for whatever period of time you've been board members. But the rules suggest that first, after the chair opens a meeting, that the first thing you do is have the minutes read by the secretary. We've all been there. And then it goes on to say, and this is what we did last board I was a member of, the secretary will read the minutes, and then if someone hears something, then they can simply say, they can move to amend the minutes because, well, that's not correct, something was wrong, and then you vote on that. It's a motion. Because the idea is, especially with the open meetings law, is that you make those minutes as correct as you possibly can. People don't think it's important, but it's critically important, especially since we operate under this open meetings law. And the secretary actually is supposed to take the minutes and then write, this is what Robert says, write the corrections just by handwriting on the minutes, and then read them back, and then they'll be voted on, and once they're approved, then that's the minutes. The next agenda, according to Roberts, is officers report. Your president would, or your chair would report. Your secretary would report if you got whatever officers you might have. Next would be committee reports. If you've got any standing committees, some people do, some don't, or special committees. Robert suggested if you're going to amend your bylaws and change something or add something or change your quorum requirements, whatever the case might be, it's best done by a committee, and that would be a special committee appointed for that purpose. And you would appoint that committee and appoint the members, tell them to report back next week and present a report on what they've done. And then the fourth that they mention is really just a fancy phrase for it's called special orders, and that's listed on your punch list there. The special orders is an antiquated phrase, but it's still in there. What it means is something like nominations or elections. So maybe you have to have it's time for elections. So you post your agenda, and your agenda says nominations and elections will be on Monday night at the next meeting at 8 o'clock. So that would go, that's called a special order because it's a specially assigned thing. And actually what happens is when you get to a point in the meeting, if it's 8 o'clock and it's time for the elections and something else is still on the floor, then you can actually move to table or lay on the table or something in order to take care of that specific business. Or if you had a guest coming in, maybe you got the chairman of the county commission or whatever. And then the other, of course, is old business and then new business, and we're all familiar with that. Now, the punch list that I gave you, this is just a few, as I mentioned, of the motions, but this will get you through a meeting. Now, there are a lot of others. There are many variations, but these are what you might call foundational, and I'll step you through these. The first is what's called the main motion. So after the chair opens the meeting and then steps through the preliminaries, the reports and so forth, then if the business is presented through a main motion, that would be new business or perhaps a resolution. Resolved to congratulate the football team or whatever. That's done by resolution or actually through a main motion, actually. The next one is called postpone indefinitely. And when a member rises to make motions, because the chair cannot make motions, then the member would simply say, Madam Chair, I move to postpone indefinitely the questions that's on the floor currently. And you would want to do that. Some of these they seem a great deal alike, but they're used in different circumstances, and it doesn't matter if you say the wrong one, if everybody understands what you're trying to do. This one is used to postpone the motion that's currently under consideration for the length of the meeting. In other words, if you do that, it won't be heard anymore during the rest of that meeting, and then it will come back up again the next meeting. And if it's something that nobody can really agree on or whatever the case might be, then maybe they'll move again to postpone indefinitely. And I went ahead and put in there for you because different motions require different things. This one needs a second. Some do, some don't. This one is not amendable, and it's got to be debated, or it can be debated if anybody wants to discuss it. Now, amendments. Everybody is familiar with amendments. This is used to change the main motion. It's got to be germane in our meetings, unlike the legislature. In other words, it has to pertain to the motion that's on the floor. It can't be something that's totally and completely different. It needs a second, it's debatable, and it requires a majority or a 2/3 depending on what that motion is. And Robert's rules will tell you that if the motion changes the rights of any of the membership on any of those 7 folks on that board, then it's going to require a majority, or excuse me, it's going to require 2/3 unless your bylaws say otherwise. They can say otherwise if they want to, because it affects the rights. Otherwise, it's a majority, and of course, the majority is 50 plus 1. Refer to a committee, which would be, we already talked about that. Let's say someone puts a motion on the floor. Well, we don't really know. Let's give it to a committee and let them do a little research. So you can simply, that would be your motion. I move to refer this motion to committee. Postpone to a certain time. This is typically used if it's a controversial matter, or maybe you've been there for 3.5 hours and everybody's tired. And you say, I move to postpone this thing until next meeting, which is Tuesday or whatever the case might be. But you have to state specifically in your motion what the time is. It requires a second, and it is debatable. Then the next would be limit or extend limits of debate. Would be very handy. Roberts calls for 10 minutes per person to debate a motion that's on the floor. We all know some people could talk for 2.5 hours, and some people would just a few minutes. But if you wanted other than 10 minutes, you should put it in your bylaws. If not, if you haven't, and then it's dragging on, then you can simply move, Madam Chair, I move to limit the length of debate from 10 minutes to 2 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever that would be appropriate. It requires a second and it's debatable. It requires 2/3 vote. Previous question. That's when it's debated and it's time to vote. Someone will say, I move the question, Madam Chair. What that means is let's vote on this issue. Lay on the table. Some people call this, let's table this motion. That's not the appropriate phrase. Robert gets upset about that. He wants you to say, lay on the table. This is used when something more important or previously scheduled needs to come. For instance, if you're right in the middle of a motion and it's time for nominations or whatever, then you'd say, Madam Chair, it's 8 o'clock and I move to lay on the table this motion so that we can move with the orders of the day. Next is raise a question of privilege, and this is just a fancy way of, instead of raising your hand and saying, it's cold in here, or it's hot in here, or whatever, you say, I have a question of privilege, Mr. Chairman, and you would simply state whatever the situation was. And then the last is there's 3 kinds of adjournment. One is recess, one is adjourn, and the other is adjourn or fix a time to which to adjourn. The recess is if you just need a break. You've been there and everybody's tired, they need to go to the bathroom or get something to drink, just like we've been doing in here. And you would simply just move the chair to recess, and what you'd want to do is say 5-minute recess or whatever. For adjournment, then you can move to adjourn anytime you want to. You can just say, Mr. Chairman, I move to adjourn. But it needs a second, and it is not amendable, and it's debatable. So it would depend on the pleasure of the other members. And then fix a time to which to adjourn. That would be used to continue the meeting to a later time. In other words, the meeting doesn't stop, it doesn't end, but it just pauses. It's like putting it on pause, and then it picks back up again whenever you move to restart the meeting and finish your business. And that would be if something is running on. And like I said, there are many, many motions, but in a nutshell, this is basically how Robert's Rules operates. And if you have any questions, don't ask me because I've told you everything I know. So.